I'll be talking about, in the 50 minutes that I have, about some of the tools that I've developed in my lab, along with a series of my PhD students and postdocs. So many of you already spoke about how we map business ecosystems. I thought Woody Powell's talk was very inspiring. What you could do with data when you had very limited data, but now that we have much more data, we need new tools. So traditionally what we did, and this is also what Woody Powell's study did, is the sources were relatively well known and defined, maybe clean, maybe in tabular data as well. And so the struggle there was not really to get the data, but really to transcode that data into a visual form. The great thing about structured data, we know some of the attributes. Most of the attributes are probably well coded, and we have well-defined market segments. So if you want to study biotech, we know what industry classification we may want to use. So if I look back, so I did a study as well, but this was about a decade ago in the mobile telecom industry. And so you see the yellow dots representing firms that existed. There were the incumbents, and the blue dots represented companies that were entering the mobile ecosystem. And if you see some suspects that became much more prominent, Google and Apple bring in. And so they were not really at the center of the industry. But what you saw was two clusters, really. One that was highly interconnected, which was incumbents, and those that were entering the market. But the challenges of emerging ecosystems are that that data may not be available. It might not be in a nice, clean format or highly structured. In fact, they're very dynamic, evolving, and certainly global. We're talking about a lot of small startups that are emerging. And so this full spectrum of companies is very hard to grasp. Existing industry classifications do not work, so we can't just say prepackaged software anymore. A lot of these companies exist across a variety of segments, and in fact, what Neil was talking about very much applies, that we have to understand it beyond the sectors that we think about. And it turns out there's not a single data source that captures it all. We would love to have a single data source that does it, but we actually have to do quite a bit of data integration. And that leads me actually to this particular slide. So in my lab, we think about data sources to be publicly available, proprietary, open. Certainly, we have to license some of them as well. And so traditionally, academics operate on the left-hand side, where they use data sources like Thomson Reuters or Bloomberg or Capital IQ for financial data. More recently, we might use news, Factiva or Google News. Light is a wonderful source as well, where we can get quite a bit of access to data sources. But it turns out if you want to study startups, that becomes quite difficult. There are some socially curated data sources like Crunchbase, AngelList. There's a wide variety also emerging from there as well. But it turns out you can mine a lot more data, and you can think about startups in many different ways. So if you are familiar with Glassdoor, you might know what job postings are out there. And with the job postings, you know what technologies companies are interested in, which then also helps you to understand trajectories of certain industries. We can also look at what technologies companies are using. Companies are sharing their stacks, software stacks now on StackShare. You can reverse engineer that to understand what technologies are co-used. And there's a variety of these that happen more generically, but in EdTech or in the educational space, you have things like EdSearch, which is a new site for educational technology. Or you can go to actually the MOOC sites as well. The point of this slide is data is available, and in fact, you can make sense of those data sources for competitive intelligence purposes. So we're going to talk about this unstructured side in today's talk. I do quite a bit of work also on the structured side, but the unstructured side is where it gets interesting. So in my lab, I develop a series of software tools around visual enterprise analytics. Some of them are maybe similar to what Neil has done as well on terms of mapping companies and segments as ecosites. And I'm going to be talking about some of them in my talk today. In particular, the one Pulse, where we actually mine news data. Logo maps, where we actually are mining logo maps that were mentioned. Martha had a nice slide on EdTech, but we're using actually images as data. So these are the 4 projects that I'll talk about, some in detail, and others are more at a high level. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to chat more later. So in startup positioning, what we did here is if you go to Crunchbase, and then now they have about 500,000 companies. And what turns out it has, I picked one of the companies called Instructure. which develops a tool called Canvas in the EdTech space. It turns out that you can get a lot of information of who funded them, when they were founded, products that they might. It turns out much of the information is in this unstructured part, description. This particular study across all these ecosystems is to look at the 35 ecosystem. We looked at the text, and we looked at how similar the business descriptions are of these companies. So what we have in here is a map of Silicon Valley. Again, what Woody Powell referred as the core component. The node represents a company, and the edge represents how similar the two business descriptions are of the two companies, okay? So what we have developed here is a similarity network between business descriptions. The tighter two nodes are, the more similar they are, okay? And if they're clustered, that means that they have some commonality in there. And what it turns out, if you look at the labels, now it's very hard to label individual clusters, but it turns out that two companies that might be from completely different industries are actually using the same business model description. So you could have a healthcare company describing themselves the same way maybe that a retail company has or an AI company, which actually leads to that people actually want to either be similar or differentiated to other people in the ecosystem. And the graph that you see on the right actually is an indication of there's actually an optimal point of your business model description. You don't want to be too differentiated and not too similar in order to receive the most amount of funding. And that actually is contingent also on the ecosystem that you're in. This is a forthcoming study that we have. What this is actually nice is that industries don't necessarily define ecosystems, but it's the business model descriptions that define industries as well. So you can't just say it's biotech in San Diego. It's actually much more nuanced than that. So another study that we did on venture sequencing now looks at this over time. So what do startups do over time? And if you think about each activity to be an event, we can then mine perhaps what are successful event sequences versus unsuccessful event sequences. And success could be measured either in terms of going IPO, being acquired, receiving funding, or ultimately failing as well. Because of interest is obviously those things that might lead to failure. And we did this study actually with, first with very large companies, established company on the S&P 500. And if you read this particular slide, so each vertical slice represents an alliance activity. And it tells us, okay, whether they did licensing and manufacturing and marketing and so on. And we called this originally the Enterprise Genome Project. And my colleagues in the biology department told me that I'm actually phenotyping companies, not genotyping them. So, because I'm observing something that they're doing. And so what we have here is actually event sequences of companies, of what they do over time. And the chart that you see at the bottom is actually a Markov model of the states. What that means is that if you are in a given state, so if you formed an R&D relationship, what's the most likely next thing that a company will do and when? So we can mine that data in terms of sequential activities. Now we extended this work to the startup space, and you'll see that there's, first of all, less colors. First of all, it's very hard to code events that are highly unstructured. So what we have here are founding dates, leadership changes, funding, acquisition, investments, and exits. This TBD is actually the product piece. It turns out that it's very hard now to get data on product launches by startups. But we can actually now see how these event sequences actually evolve over time, and we have a way of sequencing them. We have not done the sequence analysis for startups yet, but we have full access to the 500,000 companies that are available. A next study that we did on ecosystems of hype. And so I looked at one slide. So Gartner is very famous for the hype cycles that they release. And if you understand, there's these multiple phases of how technologies either get triggered. So you have maybe one that starts at the innovation trigger, goes to the peak of inflated expectations, and so on. And then what we then ultimately did is said, okay, can we now map what partaking in that particular technology space? And it turns out that there's a lot of these logo maps that exist. One, because you can tweet them easily, plus designers generate them, venture capitalist firms love to create them. So what we wanted to see is, okay, what can we do with this data? And we actually created a process, we've engineered a process where we can mine logo maps. So we cut the logos out, we find the groupings, we find the hierarchies, we find the labels, we put them all together across logo maps. So we use a reverse image search. And we can actually do a logo map-based intelligence on how markets are evolving. Because these logo maps are often done for these emerging markets that we have not really understood very well. And I did this actually for artificial intelligence. So what we found here across a few, maybe 20 or so logo maps, is that there's about 2,000 companies in these logo maps, and only 706 of them appear actually in multiple logo maps. And then when we looked at the clusters and we looked at labels of what they belong to, we tried to guess. We have not done a proper part on the labeling piece yet. We also did this for EdTech. So we found about 15 or 16 of these EdTech maps. And there's about 665 companies. And it turns out that there's many more that are overlapping, meaning that actually they are fairly well defined already, but there's about 200 of them that were unknown to some folks. And then when we looked at the clusters that emerged, was also enrollment management, tech learning, online learning. It's actually quite challenging to label clusters because we can't pigeonhole them. Some companies operate in multiple spaces, and that's one of the challenges. Now, when we overlaid AI and EdTech, I did not even attempt to label the clusters, but what I wanted to show you is that there is an AI space and an EdTech space, and that there are some companies that operate in both. And some of them are actually quite prominent across both spaces, but still a few companies, okay? And so what I want to leave you at is that emergent ecosystem intelligence is actually a critical capability for investors, for startup entrepreneurs, for people, all the stakeholders that we talked about. I think that these new methods can reveal quite a few new things, and I've shown you only the tip of the iceberg of what my lab is working in. Structure and strategy have a symbiotic relationship, and I think I'm going to leave you with this last part, which you all are probably clear on, is that AI and EdTech is a dynamically evolving space with many players, and the boundaries are really yet to be defined. With that, I'll leave you. Thank you.